Okay, first of all, I should welcome you all here. It's so fantastic to see so many people. We were hearing earlier in the week it would be standing room only, but it's good to see you all here, and on a school night as well. The format for tonight that we've been speaking about is possibly we have to wrap up by around 9, so the idea is that we'll chat for 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open to questions after that. I'll just let everyone get seated. No problem. Go ahead.
My mum.
Oh, you're allowed to turn up as late as you'd like. Sorry. Would you like a drink? You're okay. Now, just briefly, I'm assuming that most of you know who Christina Lamb is, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But very, very briefly, as well as writing books, Christina finds time to be a foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times. Her talents over the years have been shared between the FT, the Sunday Telegraph, New Statesman, Spectator, Time magazine, lots of people, prolific, wonderful writing on surprising topics, and you always know that something is happening when Christina pops up somewhere. I can say, as a former foreign correspondent myself, that you know that when she's there, suddenly you've got to start booking your flights, because the fact that you're not there already is a bit of an embarrassment. Now, rather greedily, she's won Foreign Correspondent of the Year about 100 times. In fact, she's only won it 4 times.
It's 5.
But, okay, 5. See, it gets worse. It gets worse and worse. She's already written 4 books in the past around Pakistan, Afghanistan, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. But now her latest collection of dispatches from her many assignments is called Small Wars Permitting. It's just out. We have some copies here which you can buy later on. And it's a really entertaining, surprising book, surprising in that it's incredibly diverse. I think we have all come to know Christina as someone who, hangs out with the Mujahideen and has extraordinarily rare and precious moments with white farmers in Zimbabwe, for example, and gives you real insights into critical points in people's lives. But in this book, you also find her doing the samba at Carnival in Brazil.
Not going to demonstrate.
No, thankfully. No, apparently you're not very good at that. We need to talk about that. And also, hanging out with Princess Diana and writing in that kind of very astute, beautiful, sensitive way, whereby she just takes you into these people's lives, and you don't necessarily expect to find that in a Christina Lamb book, or I didn't, and certainly that's one of the real treats about this book. So tonight I was thinking it would be great to talk through some of the experiences that you relate in the book, but we're also, I think, some of us hoping for some insights into the places that you know very well. Obviously, Pakistan and Afghanistan are ongoing stories, and I'm sure there'll be questions about that. And you should feel free to you're off duty, it's all off the record, it's all just between us, so whatever you'd like to say. Yeah. Now, your book begins and ends with Pakistan. I mean, you also, we also need to visit Afghanistan, Latin America, and Africa. But firstly, why is Pakistan so significant?
Pakistan, it was kind of by accident, which I think a lot of being a foreign correspondent is kind of serendipity. And when I left university, actually dreaming of being a novelist, I went to work at the FT just as an intern for the summer. And one day the foreign editor couldn't go to a lunch that he was supposed to be going to of South Asian politicians. So he said to me, "Oh, you're interested in that part of the world. I'd been on holiday to India, so you go along." So I went, and I sat next to a man who was then the Secretary General of Benazir Bhutto's PPP. And he said to me, "Would you like to interview Benazir?" She, at that time, was living in exile in the Barbican. So I said, "Yeah, of course." So he arranged his interview, and I went to interview her, and it was my first piece for a national paper. And we also got on very well. And after that, she went back to Pakistan. This was 1987. And I went to work for Central TV as a trainee reporter. Was the most junior person in the newsroom. And one day I came home from work, and there was this gold inscribed invitation on my mat, and it was an invitation to Benazir's wedding. So I went to it, of course, and it was in Karachi in December 1987. It was an incredible introduction to Pakistan because the wedding went on for about 10 days. It was like something out of Arabian Nights, and lots of colours and beautiful silks. And she'd invited me as a friend, not as a journalist, so I got access to lots of different, quite private ceremonies. And the thing that I liked most, apart from all the colours and smells, was the late night discussions that used to happen about how to get rid of Pakistan's then military dictator, General Zia. And coming from England, I'd never thought about sort of military dictatorship and how you got rid of it and what it was like living under it. And so it just was fascinating. And so I decided that I would go and live in Pakistan. So I came back and gave him my notice. It wasn't a huge decision because the job that I had at Central TV, being the most junior person, I was covering things like sort of knitting exhibitions. And I remember the last story I ever did for them was of a man who turned a car back to front. So it looked like it was going forwards when it was going backwards. So somehow the choice between covering that or fighting against military dictatorship in Pakistan wasn't too difficult. So I gave him my notice, packed a case with everything that I thought a foreign correspondent needed, which I had no idea, and was things like a huge bag of wine gums. I had a copy of Kipling's Kim and a Tandy, which some of you might remember before the days of laptops, Tandy word processors, which had green screens with green writing. It was very difficult to see, and you could only see 3 lines at a time. So I set off with this and flew to Pakistan. But all the foreign editors that I'd gone to see before I went out there all said, we're not interested in Pakistan, we're interested in Afghanistan, because at that time the Russians were still in Afghanistan. So I decided I would go and live in Peshawar. And actually only when I got off the flying coach, which was this packed minibus which drove up the Grand Trunk Road and arrived in the old city of Peshawar about dusk, only when I arrived there did I realise or think about the fact that actually I didn't have a clue what I was going to do. I didn't know anybody there. Somehow when you're 21 that doesn't seem to matter very much. And so I got taken by a rickshaw to a place called Green's Hotel, which is where I later discovered where arms dealers used to stay. I discovered this when somebody tried to sell me a Chinese multi-barrel rocket launcher. And that first night, I'll never forget, I lay on the bed and there was no curtains in the room. And so you could see out the window this sort of serrated mountains, which was what separated Pakistan from Afghanistan. And Afghanistan seemed to me the remotest place I could possibly imagine. So I remember lying there and just being fascinated by the idea that I would be crossing back and forth over those mountains, and spent the next 2 years doing that.
Why the drive for the remote? What was the attraction in that? Had you been someone who had kind of grown up travelling to exotic places and had a taste for it, or?
I grew up in South London, in Morden, the southernmost stop of the Northern Line, which is not very exotic, and then Sutton. And I think in a way that sense of not really being anywhere that mattered, being sort of on the edge of things, neither being in a city nor being in the countryside, was quite frustrating. And so it made me really want to escape all of that and go and have adventures.
And did you feel, I mean, you talk about turning up with your handy Tandy, but beyond that, do you feel like you were just learning on the ground, that this was a craft that you would teach yourself, or it would teach you rather than needing anything?
I'm not sure I really thought about it very much. I really wanted to go and travel and meet people, and I had always wanted to write. And I could see that even though foreign editors were actually at that time not interested in Pakistan, I could see that it was going to be a big story, because General Zia, the military ruler, had been in power then for 11 years. The Americans had supported him for all that time because of his help for the war in Afghanistan, if you see any similarities to the situation now. And they were starting to lose patience with him. so it was clear to me something had to happen.
So something was changing, and it felt the right place to be.
And it really did feel like the right place to be.
I mean, Benazir Bhutto, it's kind of very difficult to move beyond that topic quickly. You also end the book with recounting another very kind of personal experience with Benazir.
Yeah, I end the book with being on the bus with Benazir in October when she went back, and I was on the bus when it was bombed. I have to say, she was in London a few weeks before she went back, and I met her, and then we talked, and she and some of her political colleagues all said to me, when we go back, because you covered all this 20 years ago and we've known you for all this time, you must come with us on the bus, so don't worry, we'll get you, you'll be the only journalist on the bus. So to start with, I said, great, that's fantastic. Then I thought, she's got these death threats. I'm not sure I really want to be on that bus. So when we flew to, so there was a whole lot of journalists flying out with her, flying out from here to Dubai, then she joined and then flew on from Dubai to Karachi. And just the flight was crazy because some of her people from her party got very, very drunk on vodka on the flight out, and one of them actually had to be offloaded at Dubai airport. It was president of PPP Canada. And so I don't think Emirates will ever again agree to fly a returning Pakistan leader. But anyway, when we got to Karachi, I thought, I'm not going to go with them, it's too risky. So I went with the other journalists. I didn't go with her and her party. And then I saw them getting on the bus, and it was very chaotic. Some of you might have been there. And so there was a group of us standing at the gate of the airport watching this bus disappear. And as I saw it start to drive away, I just thought, I have to be there, this is ridiculous. So I persuaded the policeman to let me through the gate, ran after the bus, waving, let me up. And they poured me up onto the bus. And then when I got on top, to start with, I just thought, this is so exposed, because it was an open-top bus. It was going very slowly. It was going about walking pace. There were loads of people in trees. The bus went under lots of bridges and flyovers, so we actually had to duck because the bus was so high. So I said to the policeman who was on top in charge of security, how on earth are you going to protect Benazir in this? And he just looked at the heavens and said, God knows, which was hardly reassuring. And so we were driving, and the journey went on for hours. So at the beginning I was a bit nervous, but as it went on and the atmosphere was very lively and people were waving and dancing, and after a while you started to forget about the danger of it and just be caught up with the moment, which I think happens a lot in journalism. And so when the bombs went off, we'd been on the bus for 9 hours, and by then completely relaxed, which made it very shocking when it did happen. It happened just after midnight, and Benazir had gone downstairs to the armoured part of the bus, and she'd gone down to rest her feet and to work on her speech. And I'd spoken to her just before she went down, and she was saying how happy she was to be back, and we were sort of joking about how the journey was taking so long we'd have to call in breakfast onto the bus. Anyway, and then I was talking to a man called Eitazaz Hassan, who was her main lawyer, and just as we started speaking, there was suddenly this sound, which was like concrete being dragged across, like corrugated iron being dragged across concrete. And we both just looked at each other and immediately knew what it was, but before we could do anything, the blast of hot air from the bomb just threw us to the ground. And then we both sort of started to sit up. There was probably about 15 people on top of the bus by that time. And as we started to get up, there was a second blast, which was much bigger and threw us back down again. And a huge orange flame burst at the side of the bus. It felt like everything was on fire, all the trees and all the vans around. And it was as if the street was floodlit because there was so much fire. And And I mean, your initial reaction is to be amazed that you're still alive. And then I kind of panicked, thinking, well, actually, we're the target. You know, I've been in Afghanistan before when there's been suicide bombs, but I've never been the target of it like that. So I wanted to just get off the bus, and also I was terrified that the fuel tank would explode because of all the fire everywhere. So we all started jumping off the bus, and there were 3 people on top of the bus that were dead, that were lying in pools of blood. And we got off, and I just ran down a side street. It's funny, you think, well, it's not funny, you think in things like that you try and help people, but actually just all I wanted to do was run away from it. And I ran down this side street, and a woman grabbed me and tried to take me back to the main road where all the carnage was, and there were like body parts everywhere and blood and shoes everywhere. And so I was saying, no, I'm not going back. And then she said, but you're hurt. And I said, no, I'm not hurt at all. And then I realized I was absolutely covered in blood. And it was not my blood, it was blood of the people on the bus that had been killed. So it was pretty horrific. And it was interesting talking to Benazir later that night, because she said to me the first thing that went through her head was, they've actually done it. Or she said, oh my God, they've actually done it. And I think she too, despite all the warnings and everything, never thought that they would actually do something like that. I think she hadn't realised too how much Pakistan had changed and how, you know, she'd been away 8.5 years. I could tell you, when I lived in Pakistan from 87 to 89, 90, it was the friendliest place. I had no money because I was just starting out, so I used to travel on all the local buses, stay at people's houses or at the cheapest place I could find. I never once felt threatened or anything. I just really enjoyed the time there. Now, many of the places where I used to walk around happily, like the old city of Peshawar, I wouldn't dream of walking around as a Westerner, and that's very sad.
Going back to Benazir, I mean, you had a fairly tumultuous friendship with Benazir, in the sense that there had, you know, you were virtually thrown out of the country in '89, and that had something to do with her. I mean, was it that kind of a relationship whereby you went back and, you know, time moved on and you renegotiated your relationship with her as things went on?
I mean, it's a bit like the relationship. I have this kind of love-hate relationship with Pakistan. I've twice been deported and then don't seem to have any problem getting a visa to go back, which is slightly odd. And the second time I was deported, which was in 2001, November 2001, and that was horrible because the ISI, Pakistan's military intelligence, had come and broken down the door of the hotel where I was staying at 2 in the morning. In fact, Justin Sutcliffe, the photographer I was with, is standing at the back. The same thing happened to him. And we were taken off, and we didn't know where, and there was curfew at that time, so it was the middle of the night, there was no cars around. The first thing they did was take our mobile phones, so I learnt a lesson, which is always sleep with your mobile phone under your pillow, don't leave it charging at the side. And we didn't know what would happen to us. Anyway, eventually, after 2 days, it's a long story, but we were deported. And I was so angry then, I thought, right, that's it with Pakistan, I've had so many problems. And we get put on this PIA plane, and it takes off, and then the stewardess comes up to us and says, the pilot would like to invite you into the cockpit. Now, bear in mind, this is about 2 months after September 11th. We've just had stamped in our passports that we're a threat to national security. And so I said, what? And she said, he wants you to come. So we got taken in to meet this wonderful guy called Captain Johnny Afridi with long hair in a ponytail. And basically spent most of the flight sitting in the cockpit with him. And he said to us, oh, don't worry about these goons, they've arrested me before, just ignore them. And it somehow, that just made me kind of fall in love with Pakistan again. But I didn't really answer your question about Benazir. I mean, it's true, we did have a very tumultuous relationship. She saw things very much in black and white. You're either with us or you're against us. And at the beginning of the time when I went to Pakistan, of course I'd first gone there as her friend, so when I went there and then was covering it as a journalist, she thought she was going to get very positive coverage.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of lesson about it's very difficult to live in a country where you are friends with the head of state. And after a while, when she became Prime Minister and her government was clearly more interested in making money than it was in governing. They didn't pass a single bit of legislation in the first government. And I found this very frustrating, particularly as a woman, because at that time Pakistan had notorious laws like the Hudud Ordinance, which meant that if a woman was raped, the only way she could prove it was to produce 4 male witnesses to the penetration. Now, that's impossible. And what would then happen is that they would end up in prison themselves for adultery or for sex outside marriage. And so I had interviewed lots of young women, horrible stories in prisons in Lahore and in Sindh. And
when you raised those issues with her, how did she respond?
Would always say, oh, you know, you've got to understand, we've got to keep the Islamic parties on side and it's politically difficult. And I just thought, you know, when she became Prime Minister the first time, the first woman Prime Minister of an Islamic country, in court, a woman's evidence in Pakistan was only worth half that of a man's. A woman couldn't open a bank account without a man's permission at that time. And it was astonishing to me that as a woman Prime Minister, she wouldn't do anything about those things. But as has been much reported, there was a lot of corruption in the government. And when I started writing about that, and at that time I was stringing for the Financial Times, so I met lots of business people, and they all had terrible stories about, well, largely about her husband, Mr. 10%. And when I started writing about that, she was not very happy about it.
You've got another friend who's a head of state, Hamid Karzai. Do you give him a hard time as well?
Yes, sometimes, but he doesn't really listen. I know how.
I mean, when you go back, obviously you have it moving slightly northwards. When you have an enduring affection for that place as well. I mean, when you go back now, let's leave Helmand to one side for a moment. But when you go back now to Kabul and see the Karzai government's, you know, the work in progress, do you feel heartened, encouraged?
No, I don't. It's difficult. I mean, when you've known someone, I've known Karzai also since, 88, because when I lived in Peshawar, he was spokesperson for, there were 7 Afghan resistance parties fighting the Russians, and he was spokesman for the one that was absolutely inconsequential. Nobody used to go to see them because they had almost no sort of people fighting, and so he was very happy if somebody went to see him. And he also was a real Anglophile, and he loves Tennyson's poetry and Somerset Maugham stories and Cadbury's chocolate. And so we struck up a friendship, and I lived very near him. And so we used to meet very frequently and talk about all sorts of things. And he was fascinating to me because he was from the south, from Kandahar, from the Popelzai tribe, and had this passion for the whole tribal structures, and he loved to tell the history of Afghanistan and the tribes, because I knew very little and I wanted to know more. So I would sit for hours and he would bring all these elders to come and tell me these just amazing stories of, I mean, a lot of it involved people fighting each other and revenge, and kind of these long feuds that would go on for years where entire families would wipe out other families. And it all just seemed, well, exactly like something out of Kipling. And so then, I mean, I never for a moment imagined that one day he would be president of Afghanistan. I don't think he did. So it's difficult seeing him now because, as any of you that have gone there will know, he lives, people call him the mayor of Kabul. He lives surrounded by so much security. It is really difficult. It takes, you have to allow kind of an hour to get through. You go through 7 security checks to get in to see him, dogs, x-ray machines, all sorts of things. Once I took him some of his favourite chocolates, and the guards made me open the box and take out all the chocolates and eat one of them in front to make sure that it wasn't going to kill him. In fact, he has a taster. And so he's so cut off from what's really happening in his own country. And at the beginning, when he first took over in 2001, he really wants to know what was happening outside. And when I went, he would say, tell me what people are saying. And I don't know if my people were telling me the truth. And I'm afraid now if you tell him that things are not good, he doesn't want to know. And so you see what it's like, somebody in power wanting to stay in position and not wanting to know really what's going on outside. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, as much as there have been kind of catastrophic events in Pakistan and Afghanistan, which you've covered and which have obviously affected you deeply, and you do feel kind of personally let down when things go badly there, you do talk about Zimbabwe as being the most tragic story you've ever told, the most tragic place you've ever...
Zimbabwe is definitely by far the most heartbreaking story that I've ever covered. I think because what's happened there isn't because of a war, or it's because of one man's desperation to stay in power, and he really doesn't care what he does to his own people to stay there. And I think I feel guilty too, because when it first started, where the white farms started being seized in 2000, 2001, we in the Western media so focused on the white farmers and not on what was happening to all the black farm workers. And yet at the end of the day, 18 white farmers were killed. I'm not trying to condone what happened to them, and it was awful, but that isn't very many. And hundreds of thousands of black farm workers lost everything, lost their homes, lost everything that they had, and they weren't equipped in the same way as, I mean, most of the white farmers were well educated, some of them had money outside, they were better equipped to start a new life. Most of the black farm workers ended up back in villages with absolutely nothing to eat. A lot of them were beaten and some of them were killed. And it made me feel that we'd got the story wrong and played very much into Mugabe's hands, because he's presented it as this fight against the vestiges of colonialism, and which of course it isn't at all, but by concentrating on the white farmers we made it look like that. So it's just incredibly sad to keep going there. And also it's gone on for so long. I mean, this is the 8th year now of going back and forth and seeing things just getting worse and worse for people. Last time I was there, going into villages where people literally only had 2 weeks' food to last the whole year, and also not seeing anybody my age anymore. You travel through the whole of southern Zimbabwe, you go into these villages, and all the people are either children or old people, grandparents and grandchildren. All the other people have either died of AIDS, which is exacerbated by the hunger in Zimbabwe, or they've fled the country. And 3.4 million people officially have left Zimbabwe. It's a country of only 12 million. It's probably more than that. It's hard to think of another country that has had that kind of exodus of all the educated people.
As far as I can tell from your book, there have been these kind of massive recalibrations where you've gone from kind of a fairly kind of passionate curiosity about South Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Then you've found yourself in Latin America, and then you found yourself in Africa, and now you're kind of back in Europe but revisiting other places. I mean, how difficult, it feels like a very personal business to hear you describe it, and I just wonder how difficult is it then to kind of to withdraw from a place that you know so intimately and move to somewhere completely foreign?
It was very difficult going to Brazil after being in Afghanistan and Pakistan for 2 or 3 years.
The dress sense alone changes very dramatically.
This is true. I was passionate about what was happening there, and then got deported from Pakistan, and the foreign editor of the FT, which I was then working for, invited me into his office, and he had this big map on the wall with all these coloured pins for the different offices, different correspondents around the world. And he said to me, the question you dream of as a foreign correspondent, where would you most like to go? And this was beginning of 1990, so Eastern Europe, all the regimes were falling, the Berlin Wall had just fallen, and so I thought, I really want revolution. I've had war and I want to go to one of these countries. So I said I wanted to go to Eastern Europe, and he said that's a good idea. And so yes, let's do that. About 2 days later, the editor called me in and he said, I've decided you're going to be our Brazil correspondent. So I was like, and I'd never been to Latin America. I knew nothing about it.
And do you know, how did you end up in why was it Brazil?
Because the Eastern European correspondent who had wanted to leave, having been there for 12 years with nothing really happening, had suddenly decided belatedly that it was a bit silly to move just as everything was happening. And she spoke all the languages and everything. So I was sent to Brazil, and I was pretty cross because I thought, well, Brazil, you know, nothing's happening there. I went out for lunch with the then Brazilian ambassador, who was a lovely man called Paulo Taça Flecha de Lima, whose wife actually was very close to Princess Diana. And he was very sociable, and he said to me, look, the thing is, you know, my country, Brazil, is neither an opportunity nor a threat to your country, so you're not really going to have anything to write, but you go and have a good time. So I thought, right.
And did you take that advice? Did you? No, but was it a relief in a way to not feel as though you were operating in such a kind of critical environment?
No, I was really cross.
So desperate about it, yeah.
And when I arrived, it was funny, I arrived during the World Cup in 1990, and the first morning I woke up, there was all these rockets going, and I thought, something's happening. It was actually Brazil had just won in the match. But I fell in love with Rio. In fact, the FT had said to me, we think that we should move the office from Rio to Sao Paulo, because as a business paper, Sao Paulo is, you know, where everything's happening. So I arrived in Rio, a beautiful day, drove along Copacabana, Ipanema, and I just thought, this is the most beautiful place I've ever been to in my life. I then went to Sao Paulo, which is, I think, one of the ugliest places in the world. This huge city, like 18 million people, very polluted, terrible traffic jams. And I thought, my God, I can't live here. So I called the FT and said, well, you know, there are some justifications for moving Sao Paulo, but I think Rio is still really the centre of things, which is rubbish. I mean, for a business paper, there was no reason whatsoever to be in Rio. I mean, one of my main arguments was that the biggest company in Latin America, Petrobras, was based in Rio. But in fact, Petrobras hated foreign journalists and would never speak to, it may as well have been in Timbuktu for all that was worth. But having gone there thinking nothing was going to happen, then in fact it did become a big story. And when I arrived, the president of Brazil was a man called Fernando Collor, who had just taken over the first directly elected president. And he was this very sort of glamorous, dashing figure who used to drive fast cars and be photographed piloting supersonic jets. And he liked to be, in fact, he liked to be known as Indiana Jones of Latin America. But it turned out that in between doing all of this, he was actually incredibly corrupt and holding black magic sessions in the presidential house, and all sorts of weird things were going on. And all of this was exposed because Fernando Collor tried to seduce his sister-in-law, and his brother was furious, and so his brother made a video of all what Fernando Collor was up to and deposited it with a bank in America, and then called me and a Brazilian magazine the day that the Earth Summit was starting, or the day before the Earth Summit was starting in Brazil. So and this was supposed to be Collor's big moment. All these different world leaders were gathered together, and instead this video is then released showing him up to all sorts of things. And he ended up being, well, he would have been impeached. He ended up resigning to avoid impeachment. But so.
And the Amazon also was a place that kind of you discovered, and journalistically at least, kind of very much found your feet. It was somewhere that you.
Yeah, I loved travelling in the Amazon. It was great going to places, very remote places that you felt hardly anyone had been to before. And at that time, the environment was a very big issue. This was 92. And so I was lucky and got to go and meet Garimperos and Yanomami and travel a lot.
But nevertheless, as you say, very comically in the book, male editors love a war, and men and their maps really can't be separated. So when it comes to happenings such as Iraq, suddenly you were hauled in again to kind of go out and do the dangerous thing. Did that? I mean, was there ever a time where you were unsure about taking that kind of frontline step? I mean, you keep talking about serendipity. Even being on Benazir's bus, it wasn't something you really thought about. You just got caught up in it and you just went with the moment. I mean, do you kind of rely on that instinct to carry you into driving around the edge of Basra when other journalists are losing their lives in the same place?
Yeah, I mean, I never ever thought I want to do something, I want to be a war correspondent or I want to go into dangerous places. It just happened that the places that I got interested in then became dangerous, which sometimes was kind of annoying, quite particularly. I mean, my main focus of interest, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, are all in a mess at once. It would be nice if one of them would get resolved. Last year, I complained a lot to my foreign editor that I always went to dangerous places and kept almost being shot at and things, and could I go somewhere less dangerous? So I went to Kenya in December.
I was starting to see a pattern here, Christina.
But I do think, I don't know, I think you do develop an instinct after a while, and so you know when things are not right. For example, at the beginning of the war in Iraq, I was in southern Iraq and crossed the border and was on the road to Basra, and it just felt wrong. There were no signs. I was there as a unilateral, I should explain, not embedded with the military, which had sounded great beforehand, because I thought, as a unilateral, I'd be able to cover both sides, I'd be able to talk to people both. And in fact, as it turned out, as a unilateral, it meant you basically didn't have a clue what was going on. You didn't know where the front line was. And so you were spending a lot of time driving around. And also, because the Iraqis had been under dictatorship for so long, they had no idea of free press. So to them, being a British journalist, you might as well have been a British soldier. They didn't see you as being separate from the state generally. So it wasn't really that safe. And in fact, after a while, because many of us had got TV taped on the front of our cars, and after a while I took it off because I thought it was unsafe to have that. In fact, some people put French flags then because they thought that would protect them.
Everyone was Irish in that one, as I recall.
But it was driving on that road at the beginning, it was clear to me that it just felt wrong. I can't really explain why. And I called the office and spoke to my foreign editor, and he said, the MOD are reporting that Basra is about to fall, that the 58th Division Republican Guards are about to defect, so, keep going to Basra. And I said, well, there's no signs of any British troops or anything here, are you sure? And he said, no, they're reporting that. And then he read me some wire copy, which read that US jets were pounding the bridges of Basra. Now, I was at the first of the series of bridges into Basra. There was no signs of any jets pounding anything. So I said I'm going to turn back, which actually he wasn't very happy about. But I did turn back, and shortly after that, ITN's car, which we passed on the way out with Terry Lloyd, was then attacked, and Terry was killed. And I can't explain why it felt wrong, but it just did.
So it's not luck. It's a mixture of luck and instinct, or something.
It is. But sometimes I find, if you're embedded with forces, you lose that instinct because you sort of let them think for you, and that's not always a good thing.
Was that at play in what happened in Helmand? Do you feel like, in a way, your senses were kind of slightly dulled by the fact that you were with this kind of band of brave men, and they were going to keep you safe?
Yeah, I mean, just to explain, in July 2006, I was with the Paras in southern Afghanistan, and we went on a Hearts and Minds mission, when they still were doing those, to a village called Zumbale. And because it was this Hearts and Minds mission, they left the vehicles with the big guns outside the village and went in wearing soft hats. and we walked for a mile and a half into the village. And when we got into the village, there's no signs of any children. And I mean, I've been going to Afghanistan for 20 years. Children always come and ask for candy and things. And so I should have known that something was wrong. But somehow, because I was with the parrots, I just kind of switched off.
Presumably you also weren't in a situation where you could have just wandered off and
yeah, well, I'm not sure anyway what the commander, if I'd said I think this is dangerous, was there no children, he probably would have just wondered what I was talking about. So we then went and sat with these village elders who, again, there weren't many of them, and I remarked on that, saying there are not many people, and the main elder said, well, the others are all praying in the mosque, and actually it wasn't prayer time at all. So we had this conversation with them, and then at the end of it, the main elder said, if you go out of the village that way, instead of the way we'd come in this way, you will find that there's a bridge over the canal. Now, coming into the village, we'd had to jump over this canal, and I'd actually fallen in, much to the amusement of all the paras. So going over a bridge sounded quite good. So we start walking out, and I had my notebook out. I was talking to the commander, and he said to me, well, I think that went quite well. They seemed quite friendly. And literally, as he said that, the first shots rang out. And the vehicles that we'd left outside, the people, they'd come under ambush, so they radioed that they'd had a contact. So we all sort of stopped there, looking up towards this ridge beyond where they were parked. And within, I don't know how much time, maybe a minute, we were then under fire as well. And then everybody just ran. And it was chaos, and everybody was split up. And there were all these irrigation ditches, so we were just jumping into the ditches for cover. And the ditches were about, I would say, about 8 or 10 feet high. And the first one that I jumped into, I dropped my notebook. I have never lost a notebook in 20 years of being a journalist. Whatever else I've lost, I've always kept my notebook. And I saw it like stuck at the top of this ditch. So that my first instinct, despite all these bullets and things flying over, was I've got to get that notebook. And I started climbing up, and then a bullet almost hit me, and then I thought, this is really stupid, I'll leave it. So, which was then odd, because not having my notebook made me then somehow feel less protected, which is silly. And then for the next 2.5 hours, we were running and jumping into ditches, and I wanted to stay in the ditch because the ditch seemed more safe because it was deep. And so we were in one, and I said to the soldiers that I was with, no, I was going to stay here, and they shouted at me, get out of the ditch. And just as I got out, a mortar landed where we'd been. But the frightening thing was that the firing was, we got surrounded by these people, by the Taliban. So we would run in one direction, and then all these bullets would start coming from that direction, and we'd run that way, and bullets would come. And you just thought, well, there's no way that we're going to get out of this. And I think it was by far the most frightening experience I've ever had. And I think one of the reasons was that the parrots also were frightened. I mean, they were saying things like, one of the snipers was saying to me, I'm going to keep my last bullet for myself. And then the sergeant major asked me if I could use a pistol, because he said that he thought we were going to get pinned down in the ditch and have to fight for our lives. And also, again, I was with Justin, wherever he is, who seems to always be with me when scrapes happen. And we got completely split up from each other at the beginning. So I had no idea if he was all right. So that was also horrible, not knowing, what, and you couldn't imagine that people could be surviving in all of that firing. And he was actually with the commander, who was radioing for air support, and I was screaming for air support in not very polite language, I think, and being told that all assets were in use elsewhere, engaged, which made us realise quite how much of a shortage of helicopters there were. So for 2.5 hours, we were just running and trying not to get shot at, and it was really frightening. The funny thing, towards the end, I mean, it was impressive. At the beginning, the paras it was really chaotic, but then when they realised they weren't going to get help, they managed to regroup. And finally we came out onto this open land, and then they were happy to be on this open land. Now I felt really exposed when we were running along this open hillside. They were happier because they could then see what was happening. But, and that was quite horrible when they were saying, you know, run across here. But then they wanted us to have big gaps between each other so no one could fix on a target. And I remember the Sergeant Major, because I was trying to stick near someone else, and he was saying, no, don't do that, this isn't fucking Club Med.
So how you wrote that story, an incredibly vivid story, and in fact it led to a fairly immediate kind of boost in numbers, British numbers, and certainly a sense, I suspect here, of the seriousness of the engagement. I mean, when you spoke to those soldiers after the story had been published, when you've had contact with them since that time, what do they think about, I suppose, what happened and you and the role that you play? Because I'm always intrigued by, after the fact, how the soldiers think about the job that we do.
Well, they were very happy, because I think the most frustrating thing for the soldiers in Helmand was that their story wasn't being told back here, and they felt there they were fighting in these terrible situations, and that people didn't know. People, I mean, at that time, people were still thinking, oh, this was sort of reconstruction. You
Not
know,
a shot will be fired. Yeah.
So for them to actually have their story told, they were very happy about it.
I'm being greedy. I think I should probably open to questions. I've got lots of other questions, so I will keep going quite happily if anyone doesn't have any ideas. But please feel free to raise a hand and ask a question if anyone's that way engaged. Oh, okay. We've got one. Sorry, I think you have to actually say who you are as well.
In Tanzania, nationalisation of farmland was such a disaster that they've given the land back to, 40 years later, to the white farmers who expropriated. Do you think something like that might happen in Zimbabwe?
It's difficult to know. I mean, every so often Mugabe's regime say, oh, we're going to allow the white farmers back. But I think it's gone so far now, it would be very difficult, and they would have to, I can't see them going back while Mugabe is still there, because they just wouldn't have any guarantees. Any moment he could then again say, well, actually I've changed my mind. And I mean, the farms have been completely wrecked. These were very high-tech farms. Zimbabwe had the highest yields in the world for a lot of its crops. And so they had very high-tech irrigation systems, greenhouses, and all of that's gone. It's all been destroyed. And the land, when you drive through, it just looks like weeds and burn. I mean, it just looks like some terrible scourge has happened to it. So to me, it looks like it would take a very long time to recover. But then farmers I've spoken to say, no, it is very fertile land, and actually it wouldn't take that long, but you'd need to put in a huge investment all over again, and who would be prepared to do that? There are quite a few white farmers still living in Zimbabwe, not on farms, but in the city, doing other things and trying to make a living, who I think are hoping eventually they would go back. But many more have left, are here and in Australia and South Africa.
I'm going to ask the chick question while people are being shy. We're talking about the fact that quite often, our male counterparts who go to do a foreign story will quite often see it as critical that they speak to the foreign minister, and they see the story very much in geopolitical terms. This is a bit of a cliche, but forgive the generalisations. Whereas certainly what's so powerful, I think, about your book, especially when you see everything collected together, is how much the stories are driven by the people who you meet, and how many of them are kind of very personal stories and very kind of intimately told stories. Is that a fair differentiation? I mean, does that match your experience, or is that an apocryphal term?
No, I think it is. I mean, when war happens, in particular, it seems to me the men are much more interested in the bang bang and the technical.
Well, they morph, don't they? They start wearing those trousers with too many pockets instantly.
And those vests with they
exactly. Suddenly they turn into fishermen or something.
And you know, frankly, I find it pretty difficult to tell the difference between the sound of an RPG and different kind of missiles and things. And whereas some of my male colleagues are, you know, absolutely obsessed by that. And
so I always think they become quite soldierly. I mean, they have the language, you know, they have the vocabulary to talk about weaponry in terms of. They seem to have all kind of studied up on it before they turn up. And I wonder whether or not, in a way, that means that women who are there are kind of are from the outset, even in their language, kind of slightly separate to the business of the business of the war. That doesn't mean that we don't understand it and don't write about it, but I wonder whether or not we're just a little bit more separate from it.
I think I feel strongly that the real story is not necessarily the people fighting, but the people behind the lines, who are usually the women and I am constantly amazed by women who are able to feed and shelter and protect their children and educate them in these terrible situations. And I think that story is very important to tell, and that's what I want to do.
Do you ever have troubles, have you had troubles with kind of editors who insist on the bang bang, who want the bang bang and aren't that interested in Sadia, who lives behind the lines and has 8 children to feed?
Yes, I have, and I mean, you end up having to be a bit sneaky about how you do it.
So
you
bang 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 2 cars and then
yes.
living behind the lines with Sadia with 8 children. Kind of thing.
Yes, I think so. I have to be careful because I think my editor's here. Yes. But I do think that is a huge difference. And I think also, I mean, the fact that I'm not sure if I'm right in saying I think all news editors of the national papers in Britain at the moment are all male. And I think that actually has a huge impact on the way stories are covered, because they definitely have a different view of what is the story than women do, I think. And I also think, sorry men, but that women are much better journalists than men, because I think women are better at listening.
Listening? What a notion, a journalist having to do that. I mean, one of the other things, I mean, you mentioned the British angle and the fact that, you know, on occasion you've been caught up in what, for example, the white farmers in Zimbabwe feeling as though you were telling a story with a domestic spin or a domestic twist. And it was such a lovely experience to read about Portugal and not read about Madeleine McCann in your book, and actually read about Portugal, the place, and what happens there, and in its own right, with its own stories and its own tensions and political history. I mean, do you feel like they're very much kind of, you use different parts of your brain to do those different kinds of stories? I mean, is it something that you fight against doing?
No, I love telling sort of quirky stories. I feel like what I do is I'm a storyteller. I go and talk to people and they tell me their stories, and sometimes that is something horrible and it's atrocities and terrible things, or they're warlords, and sometimes it's more whimsical kind of things, and that's really what I like to do, and I think always have done.
Mm. It does feel a slightly more personal book, in the sense that there's a few stories about your husband and about your child and about kind of family life and making decisions to do with family life and recognising the tension. I mean, does that feel, to me, that feels like a very brave thing to do? Did that feel like a difficult thing to do?
I think it changes the way you report once you have a relationship or a child in particular. I mean, frankly, when I first had my son, who's now 8, I thought this is not a job to do as a mother, because I'm away so much and it's dangerous. So I thought about giving him my notice, and I was then working for the Sunday Telegraph, and I took a sabbatical to go and write a book about the Amazon. Having said that, I took my then 2-year-old son down the Amazon, which my mother was, I think, slightly horrified by. And then moved to Portugal to write this book. And we moved and arrived there on the 9th of September 2001. So spent the first couple of days getting the flat ready. And then the 11th of September was the first day, literally switched my laptop on and think, right, now I'm going to write. And shortly afterwards, I got a phone call saying what happened. And my sabbatical was cancelled. And then I went, well, first to London, but then to Afghanistan. But then I never really thought twice about it because it was Afghanistan. I mean, it was a place that I cared about. And I'd also felt kind of guilty about what had happened there because, you know, for 2 years I lived there, went back and forth with the Mujahideen across the border and got to know them very well. And then once the Russians left, I mean, it was just shocking how overnight the diplomats, the spies, the aid workers just left and abandoned the country. I couldn't believe it, really. I was very naive, I suppose. And I stayed, but then it became a very different kind of war. The Afghans started fighting each other, and I became very disillusioned and was in a battle for Jalalabad, which was the first city that they tried to capture after the Russians left. And so many people, I mean 10,000 people were killed within 2 days, which is more than in just about any other fighting in Afghanistan in such a short time. And it was just so awful the way they were all blaming each other and fighting each other. And so I also got disillusioned and decided that I didn't want to go back. And it was also, I mean, that was the first time I really saw civilians dying in large numbers, because what happened was the Mujahideen, as they attacked with their rockets, the communist government air force was bombing the city, and the people living inside trying to flee got caught between the two. So, I mean, you were seeing thousands of people dying. And up till then, although I'd seen people being killed in the fighting, it hadn't been on that kind of scale, and it was really fighters that were killed generally. It wasn't ordinary people. In fact, actually, I mean, Afghanistan at that time, guerrilla war, I guess I went into the country 11 times and probably only saw action 4 times. It was a very difficult war to cover because you just never knew what was going to happen where. And you'd have these terribly difficult, risky, long journeys to get into the country, and you'd be frightened you were going to go on a mine, or you'd be bombed by a Soviet helicopter, and you were dressed in disguise, and you were eating stale naan bread, and it was all pretty difficult. And then you'd get to this place and they'd say, shame you weren't here yesterday, we had a big battle. Or they'd tell you that they'd shot down a Soviet helicopter the day before, and strangely there would never be any sign of wreckage. So I think the capacity for exaggeration in Afghanistan is something else. But so I got very used to kind of not necessarily expecting to get a story. And it's interesting how much the job has changed, because in those days, it was long before satellite phones, so you would go, you'd be away for weeks, and you wouldn't be able to file anything while you were there. And then even back in Pakistan, there was no direct dialing from Peshawar, so you used to have to bribe the telex operator at the public call office. And so it was a really long process, actually, being able to get the story back. Now I can send a story back from anywhere.
That's changed everything massively, hasn't it? And I suppose also the fact that you can get blanket coverage, you know, from the front line of close to the front line of a war on kind of 24-hour satellite television means that perhaps the room for discovering your own story has grown smaller. I mean, do you...
Yeah, I think it's great that we can file stuff from everywhere and anywhere, but you used to have a lot of time to think about what you'd seen before you sent the story back, which was good. And it was also far less stuff to carry.
What about, yeah. I'll take it.
Hi, I'm Georgia. I just want, and one that must make it quite really competitive between correspondents as well, kind of who gets there first. But also, what I'm really interested in was when, I think it's in the same circles of Herat, and you wrote that at age 21 you just pushed off to Afghanistan and fell in with the Mujahideen. And then, who did you send articles back to? Did you go out there completely alone, unprotected, and then just thought, oh, I'll send some articles back, and they got published? What article was your kind of big break?
I mean, before I went out, I went to speak to foreign editors, so I didn't just go out not knowing what I was going to do with what I sent back. So I had this very vague agreement, really, from the FT that they would pay for stuff if they published it. And because I never saw the papers or anything, I mean, it felt a bit like just sending stuff into a black hole. You know, you would just send it. But I was lucky because Afghanistan was obviously quite a big story, and most newspapers didn't allow their staff correspondents in at that time. So most of the stuff being sent back, and also staff correspondents weren't prepared to go for that amount of time. So freelancers were people that were getting the better material. I mean, the people at the Frontline Club, the Frontline TV people, that's what they were doing. And all the best stuff that came out from television footage was by them. So it was kind of able to send stuff on Afghanistan. And once you were there, then other papers sort of saw that you were there and started getting in contact. But also, after I'd only been there a fairly short time, the president of Pakistan was killed in an air crash. So it just doesn't sound like everywhere I go, presidents.
Yeah, there is a pattern.
The president of Pakistan was mysteriously killed in an air crash. So Pakistan suddenly became a story. And that was actually that night, I mean, I'll never forget, I was supposed to be going with the Mujahideen to Kabul with Abdul Haq's people, and it had taken ages to persuade them to let me go. They were against the idea of having a woman. Abdul Haq always used to say, girls don't go to war. And so I'd actually had to go to one of their training camps and show that I was tough and all of this. And so finally, and then there was constant delays that they were waiting for ammunition and things to go. So it kept getting put off. Finally, they said we were going. And I was pretty nervous about the trip because it was going to be dangerous and long. So the night, and we were due to be going, I think, about midnight, setting off. And so I was at a Pakistani friend's house. And there is a market just outside of Peshawar, a smuggler's market called Bara, where you used to be able to buy Russian vodka, which had been smuggled in, which everyone called Gorbachev. And so I tried to persuade my friend to go and buy some vodka so I could have a vodka before I went. And he really didn't want to go, and he kept saying, oh, no. And, anyway, in the end, I persuaded him. And then he came back after a very short time, and he said, you won't believe what I've just heard. I've heard that the President, General Zia, has been killed with all the top military in an air crash. And I said to him, if you don't want to go buy this vodka, you come up with a better excuse than that. But he was right. And then it was so difficult to get a line to England. I was almost in tears. We were calling the operator over and over again, trying to get her to put me through to London. Finally, I got through, and then, I mean, ran up an enormous phone bill because we were so frightened of losing the line that we just kept the line open for hours while I wrote and filed the story. So that was lucky, and Pakistan then became a big story after that, and so then there was no shortage of people to write for. And there weren't many people actually based in Pakistan at that time.
There's another question, yeah.
Stephanie Basari. I just wondered if you think there's still the same emphasis on foreign news reporting in print journalism as, say, when you were starting out. Do you think it would be different today if you were starting out, now?
Actually, I think, I mean, 9/11, whatever else it did put much more focus back on foreign news, and people also realised the link between what was happening here and what's happening in places very far away, like Afghanistan. So yeah, I think at the moment there is, obviously depending on what newspaper you read, but there is more interest again. But there was definitely a period where, a few years ago before that, where I felt like there wasn't much interest. I don't know what will happen in the future.
There's behind you, up to it. Yeah.
Eleanor Mills. Hi, Christina. Are you frightened of dying when you go on these expeditions? And what do you say to your son and your husband when you're setting off? Sorry, I always wanted to know that.
I never think about dying. I think you wouldn't go to these places if you started to think about all the bad things that can happen to you. I guess, what I try and explain in the book, it's not all horror. A lot of it is fun, and sometimes things turn out bad that you've gone into. If you haven't gone in, even the ambush in southern Afghanistan, it wasn't supposed to be a dangerous trip. We were supposed to be going, just talking to villagers about building a school or something. So you can't always know that you're going into something very dangerous. And no, we don't talk about what might happen, because I think then that would make it very difficult to do. I think probably should ask Paolo this, but it's slightly odd in that I've basically always been a foreign correspondent. I didn't have a period of being here for a long while doing something else and then went out. I went out very young, and so it's kind of, almost don't know anything else. And so I think also, it is addictive. You do, the hardest thing in a way is a war happening and you not being there after a while. And it can be very frustrating coming back here. I remember the first time I came back from Afghanistan, and that was the height of the Thatcher years, and all my friends from university had all gone into sort of jobs in the city, and so I came back and went to a dinner party, and everybody was talking about how much money they were making and how they were working such long hours, they're having to send out for clean shirts and things. And I was thinking, I just come back from seeing people with nothing, I'm seeing people being killed, and it was really difficult I just couldn't find a way of conversing with those people, because it just seemed like our worlds were so different. So then it became easier to go back, actually, to Afghanistan and these places than it did to come here. And there was a long period, I think, where that was true. Now that I have a child, that's kind of different, because it's very grounding. When I come back, I have to go and pick him up from school and do things. I can't come back and sort of wallow in what I've seen.
So there's a man, yeah, just...
Hello, Nick Leader. In your travels around the Middle East and in Pakistan in particular, what are people thinking about the coming U.S. election? Do they think that a Democrat in the White House could offer any improvement?
Well, in Pakistan, which I just came back from a couple of weeks ago, I don't think, after Hillary Clinton talked about, sending American troops into Pakistan, they're not very optimistic, I think, whoever wins. So, and that's the place that I know most about what people think. I mean, it's an interesting situation that there is this country which is supposed to be America's strongest ally in the region for the war on terror, and it is by far the most anti-American place to go to. I mean, people are absolutely, we will find many people there who admire Osama, hate George Bush, but not just that, sort of hate Americans, and that's one of the reasons, being British, you're associated with that, and it's become a much more dangerous place to go. And I just last week was talking to a very senior British official who said to me that he felt that when Benazir went back, that they might as well have painted a bullseye target on her forehead, because the way that she went back as a part of this British-American deal was immediately meant that she was going to be a target.
Sorry, another one behind you. We're at the back, yeah.
You say that women are kind of the best journalists, foreign correspondents. But I was just wondering, was there ever a moment that you kind of wished that you were a man?
That's a good question. Only sometimes in persuading, I mean, it's harder sometimes to persuade fighters, whether army or militia or whatever, to take you seriously, or to even to take you with them, because they think as a girl you're going to be a kind of liability. So that is annoying. But generally I think it's a huge advantage, because particularly in the places that I go to, because in Afghanistan, for example, my male colleagues basically don't have access to half the population, whereas I can talk to any women, and I've never had a man refuse to speak to me there. I've never quite worked out what Afghans think about Western women journalists. It's almost as though we're this kind of third sex or something, like asexual.
Honorary man status.
I mean, I've interviewed plenty of men in Iraq and Afghanistan, things who won't look you in the face when you're asking them questions, and that's quite odd. And also I've found, I mean, mostly I travel on my own. Occasionally if I've travelled with a photographer, a male photographer, often the people I'm speaking to will address the male photographer, and that's really annoying. I'm asking the question and then they're speaking to, in fact, Justin will remember we've had an interpreter once who kept saying that's a stupid question and then asking him for more sensible questions. And also in cars, they won't listen to me saying where I want to go. They want the male photographer to say the place, so that can be very annoying. But as mostly I travel on my own, then it's not an issue.
Sorry, David Stewart. I think it was General Massoud who was assassinated. In terms of national leadership, if he'd survived, potentially, how much difference might that have made?
I think the problem is that Afghanistan is very divided between the north, the Tajiks in particular, and the Pashtuns in the south. And Massoud was a Panjshiri, a Tajik, and was... So the Pashtuns would never, I think, generally have accepted him as a national leader. And now Karzai is a Pashtun, and that's very difficult for many northerners to accept. So it's very whoever you had, but he was certainly somebody of real stature that people really admired, and because he'd always fought against the Taliban and the Russians before that, and was a great strategist too. So it was a huge loss for Afghanistan.
Sorry, there's another.
Joe Jackson. I was interested to know what you think will happen in the forthcoming Pakistani elections, and how you see generally the situation in the country panning out there.
Well, when I just came back a couple of weeks ago, Pakistan is the most depressing that I've ever known it. I mean, whatever you think about Benazir, and she had many flaws, she was the best hope that there was for Pakistan, and without her, and she was a truly national leader, and without her it's very difficult to see any reason for any optimism at all in the short term. I'm not even completely convinced that the elections will happen. If they do, there is tremendous scepticism that they will be free and fair. The last elections that Musharraf oversaw were not free and fair, although the West turned a blind eye to that. This time I think there's more pressure on him from outside, but you know, frankly, there's a lot of scope for him to do what he likes. And even if they are totally free and fair, I think Benazir's party will get a big sympathy vote because of what happened to her, but I don't think they would get a majority, so you're probably going to have some kind of hung parliament, and I think a lot of instability in the future.
Can you see the general, or President Musharraf, accepting a coalition government, taking any notice of a coalition parliament, if there isn't kind of one?
I mean, the real problem in Pakistan is that Musharraf who sees himself as the solution to everything, is really now the problem. I mean, if you saw the polls recently that showed more than half the people in Pakistan think that he was involved in Benazir's killing. Now, I don't personally think he was involved. I think probably elements from the agencies, as people call the intelligence. But the way that the government dealt with her assassination made it look like it was a cover-up. I mean, the way that they hosed down the road and the vehicle within a few hours, the way that they came out with this thing that she'd fractured her head on the sunroof. I mean, it all just looked like they were trying to cover up. And then they conveniently produced this transcript of Baitullah Masood, the Taliban, so-called Pakistani Taliban in the tribal areas, who is supposed to have, according to this transcript, be sitting there saying, hello, I'm in Anwar's house in Street X in this area, and we're talking about the killing. I mean, it doesn't mention Benazir's name, but and it's just hard to believe that anybody would really have that kind of conversation, given that everybody knows that all the people that have been caught in Pakistan have all been, or almost all been, caught through telephone interceptions. So I think that was very dubious.
Last questions. One. Yeah.
Cornelia Fuchs, after the murder of Daniel Pearl, did you change anything in the way you work in Pakistan as a journalist?
No, because actually what I talked about earlier about the being abducted in the middle of the night by Pakistan intelligence, that was actually 2 months before Daniel Pearl's killing, and that made me change how I worked, because that made me realise, that they were, well, I already knew that they were monitoring everything foreign journalists were doing, particularly in Baluchistan, in Quetta. I mean, when I was deported the first time from Pakistan, I was questioned by ISI, and they produced a file which was labelled Activities of Christina Lamb, and in it they had things like letters my mum had sent me, photocopies of these letters, talking about her job at school and what her friends were doing, and that's the extent that they were going to. So it made me very wary about what I did in Pakistan, and to this day I think it's actually the most dangerous. Depends what you're reporting on, but if you touch on things that they're very sensitive about, it is the most dangerous place to report on, I think, because in Iraq, Afghanistan, generally who the bad guys are, whereas in Pakistan you don't. A lot of the bad guys are actually supposed to be the good guys. They're the ones supposed to be on your side, but actually they're not, and they're maybe involved in running the country, and so that makes it all much more complicated. And we saw with Daniel Pearl's killing, I mean, Omar Sheikh, who is said to be behind it, was in ISI custody for a week before Pakistani police knew that they had him. So what were they doing with him for a week? It's very suspicious. And why will they not extradite to this day Omar Sheikh? There are things to hide. I think the scary thing about Pakistan is that the time that I lived there in the 80s, the ISI was very involved in backing these different militant groups to fight as proxies in Afghanistan and Kashmir in particular. And after 9/11, when Musharraf was given this "you're either with us or against us" ultimatum, and if you read his book, he says, I war-gamed the United States as an adversary and decided that we couldn't take them on. Now that doesn't sound like the words of a loyal ally. And so then policy was supposed to switch 180 degrees, and they were supposed to now be against these militant groups and close them down. And they clearly didn't do that. Now I think the last couple of years, Musharraf, under a lot of pressure, has tried to stop the camps and these organisations, but I think they've lost control of them. I mean, you've had them use them for sort of 20 years, funded them, had training camps, and then overnight you say, all right, we don't go home. And so that is the scariest thing, I think, in a way, that they've now lost control entirely. It's a very bleak note to end.
It is quite a bleak note, so we're not going to end on that. We're going to take one more question. So.
Graham Patterson. Christina, where would you like to go that's really nice?
There we go. Thank you, Graham.
That's awful. Well, I keep complaining that it's about time we had a war in Tuscany, so we had a war with nice food and wine instead of in horrible places. Where would I like to go? Probably back to Latin America, actually, and Brazil, and try not to bring plague and pestilence in my way.
I mean, in the book it's quite clear that in the early stages of your career you were very much kind of motivated by your first front page. I mean, you talk about your first front page, and I wonder now what moves you to keep working, to keep seeking out these stories, to keep going to these places.
Not at all, if I can say that, what appears on the page. I mean, it's much more actually what people say to me and and being able to tell their story, and getting and really having people trust you. And I mean, I think trust is an incredibly important thing in journalism. I don't believe ever of doing something where you get a good story and you burn somebody so they won't speak to you again. I can't see the point of that at all. I think the important thing is to build out relationships, and I have relationships in the places that I have gone to for years, and I know that when I go there I can completely trust those people because they've been able to trust me, and that is really important to me. I mean, I'm not sure if this sounds a bit odd. When after the bus bombing, I really thought this is too dangerous. These things keep happening, these narrow misses. And also was upset because my son was watching on television when it happened, and I had merrily phoned home, you know, saying, "Hey, Mummy's on top of the bus." And so when it happened, he saw it, and he said very matter-of-factly to Paolo, "Do you think Mummy survived?" Well, I managed to phone very quickly, so they knew that I was all right. But it was horrible to think that he'd said that, although Paolo said he went then straight back to playing PlayStation. So I thought, you know, it's not fair to put a child through that. But the night I came back, I spoke at a bar council meeting on Zimbabwe here in London, with a woman some of you might be familiar with called Beatrice Mtetwa, who is a very, very brave human rights lawyer, amazing woman. And I come back thinking, I can't go back and do this anymore. And then we started talking about Zimbabwe, and of course then I got really interested in what she was saying and thinking, oh, you know, it'd be really fascinating to go and talk to that person, and it's really important to cover that. And she also said to me, you know, please don't stop going back. It's really important for us that people keep going to the country, and even if you feel like it's not making any difference, to us, just knowing that somebody out there cares and that something's appearing, even if it doesn't seem to make a difference to what Mugabe's doing, it is important, and that meant a lot to me, actually.
Okay, on that note, which is a very positive note, thank you very much for joining us.